Eleanor Washington had lived in her Victorian home on Maple Street for 43 years. She'd raised 3 children there, buried a husband there, and tended the rose garden her mother had planted in 1952. The house wasn't just property, it was history, family, legacy. At 78, Eleanor lived alone now, her children scattered across the country with careers and families of their own. The neighborhood had changed around her. Young professionals moved in, renovated historic homes, drove up property values. Eleanor's house, with its peeling paint and overgrown garden, stood out like a sore thumb among the pristine renovations, which made it a target. Richard Morrison, a real estate developer, had been eyeing the property for 2 years. The lot was worth $800,000, maybe more if developed right. He'd made offers, lowball offers, but Eleanor refused to sell. So Morrison decided to get creative. It started with a letter from the city. Notice of code violations. The house was cited for peeling paint, overgrown vegetation, a loose gutter. Fines totaling $15,000 if not corrected within 60 days. Eleanor stared at the letter in confusion. Her fixed income barely covered groceries and medication. $15,000 might as well have been $15 million. She called the number listed. A board clerk explained that multiple complaints had been filed. The city was required to investigate. The violations were legitimate. Who complained? Eleanor asked. Anonymous complaints are protected, ma'am. Eleanor knew exactly who complained. She'd seen Morrison's car driving slowly past her house, seen him taking photos, seen the way he looked at her property like a wolf eyeing prey. The next letter came from Morrison's development company. Notice of intent to purchase. Given the outstanding violations and unpaid fines, the company was prepared to purchase the property as is for $200,000, a fraction of its actual value, but generous given the circumstances. Eleanor threw the letter in the trash. 2 weeks later, a man knocked on her door. City inspector. I need to assess the violations. Eleanor let him in, watched him make notes about her deteriorating hardwood floors, her outdated electrical system, her non-compliant plumbing. Things that had worked fine for 4 decades were suddenly hazardous. The fine increased to $35,000. Eleanor sat in her living room, surrounded by family photos and memories, and felt the walls closing in. She couldn't afford the fines, couldn't afford the repairs. Her children had their own financial struggles. She was alone, trapped, being systematically pushed out of her own home. That's when she remembered who she used to be. Before she was Eleanor Washington, devoted mother and widow, she'd been Judge Eleanor Reese. She'd served on the federal bench for 25 years, presiding over civil rights cases, housing discrimination lawsuits, predatory lending schemes. She'd retired after her husband's death, taken her late husband's last name to honor his memory, and quietly disappeared into peaceful obscurity. Morrison had no idea he was trying to steal a house from someone who'd spent a quarter-century destroying people like him in court. Eleanor picked up the phone and called her former law clerk, now a partner at a major civil rights firm. David? It's Judge Reese. I need your help, and I need you to keep this very, very quiet. David Chen arrived the next day, accompanied by a forensic accountant and an investigator. They spent 3 hours reviewing Eleanor's documents, the city notices, Morrison's purchase offers. This is textbook predatory real estate fraud, David said, his voice tight with anger. Judge, why didn't you call me sooner? I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid. I'm an old woman. I thought maybe I was imagining things. You're not imagining anything. Morrison's been running this scheme in 3 other neighborhoods. Targets elderly homeowners, especially people of color, files false complaints with the city, racks up violations and fines, then swoops in with lowball offers. If they refuse, he forecloses on the fines. Can he do that? Unfortunately, yes. Unpaid municipal fines can result in property liens and eventual foreclosure. It's legal, but it's predatory. And it's definitely discrimination. David smiled. But he picked the wrong target this time. Eleanor's eyes sharpened with the focus she'd once used from the bench. What's the plan? We let him think he's winning. You accept his offer, sign the preliminary paperwork. Then, at closing, we reveal who you really are and hit him with a federal lawsuit for housing discrimination, elder abuse, and fraud. We'll also notify the DOJ. This crosses state lines and affects protected classes. Morrison's looking at federal charges. I want to face him, Eleanor said quietly. I want him to know exactly who he tried to rob. The closing was scheduled for 2 weeks later at Morrison's office, a sleek downtown space designed to intimidate. Eleanor arrived in her best dress, playing the role of frail elderly victim. David accompanied her, introduced as her nephew helping with paperwork. Morrison greeted them with practiced sympathy. Ms. Washington, I know this is difficult, leaving your home, but trust me, this is for the best. You'll have enough money to live comfortably, and we'll take care of all those costly repairs. Eleanor nodded meekly. I suppose you're right. Morrison's assistant, Jennifer Clark, laid out the closing documents. Eleanor pretended to struggle reading the small print. I'm sorry, my eyes aren't what they used to be. Could you explain this section? Morrison leaned forward, condescending. This just says you're selling the property as is, accepting $200,000 and waiving all future claims. Standard language. Standard for theft, David said quietly. Morrison's smile faltered. Excuse me? David pulled out a folder. Mr. Morrison, before my aunt signs anything, I think you should review these documents. They're from the Federal Housing Administration, the Department of Justice, and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. Morrison's face paled. Eleanor straightened in her chair, her entire demeanor changing. The frail old woman disappeared, replaced by someone with steel in her spine and decades of courtroom experience in her eyes. Allow me to reintroduce myself properly, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. I'm Judge Eleanor Reese, retired from the Federal District Court for the Northern District. I presided over housing discrimination cases for 25 years. And Mr. Morrison, you've just attempted to defraud a federal judge. Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish. David continued. We've documented everything. The false complaints filed with the city. We traced them back to shell companies you control. The inflated fines. We have testimony from city inspectors you bribed. The below-market purchase offer, textbook predatory targeting of elderly homeowners. He slid papers across the table. You've done this to 17 other families in the past 3 years. 12 were elderly women of color. That's a clear pattern of discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. You can't prove. Actually, we can. Eleanor pulled out her own folder. I spent 2 weeks reviewing your operation. You're not as careful as you think. The paper trail is extensive. Shell companies, bribed officials, falsified inspection reports. You're looking at federal fraud charges, housing discrimination violations, and elder abuse. That's 20 years minimum. Morrison's lawyer, who'd been silent until now, stood up. We need to postpone this closing. No. Eleanor's voice was sharp. We're not postponing anything. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Morrison. You're going to cancel all outstanding fines against my property. You're going to issue a public apology and restitution to every family you've defrauded. And you're going to cooperate fully with the federal investigation. And if I refuse, then I file the lawsuit tomorrow, notify every news outlet in the state, and personally ensure you spend the next 2 decades in federal prison. Eleanor leaned forward. I'm 78 years old, Mr. Morrison. I have nothing but time, and I spent my career destroying predators like you. Retirement was nice, but I think I have one more case in me. Morrison looked at his lawyer, who was already pulling up sentencing guidelines on his laptop and going pale. 20 to 30 years for this scope of fraud, plus civil penalties. You'd lose everything. I need time to think. You have 60 seconds, Eleanor said. I'm an old woman. I don't have patience for negotiation. Morrison sat in silence, watching his empire crumble in real time. Finally, he nodded. What do you need me to do? Within a week, Morrison had withdrawn all complaints against Eleanor's property. The city dismissed the fines. He'd also begun the process of identifying and compensating the 17 families he'd defrauded, a process that would cost him millions. Eleanor sat in her living room, the house that was rightfully hers secure once more, and called each of the other victims personally. Mrs. Thompson? My name is Eleanor Reese. I'm a retired federal judge. I believe a man named Richard Morrison tried to steal your home. One by one, she helped them, connected them with lawyers, explained their rights, turned her quiet retirement into a mission to undo the damage Morrison had caused. David found her 3 weeks later surrounded by case files. "Judge, you're supposed to be retired." "I was. Then some idiot tried to steal my house." Eleanor smiled. "Turns out retirement is boring anyway. This is more fun." Morrison's agreed to a consent decree. He's surrendering his real estate license, paying $4 million in restitution, and cooperating with federal investigators. He'll avoid prison time, but his career is over. Good. But not good enough. Eleanor pulled out another file. "I've identified a pattern. Morrison's not the only one running this scam. There are at least 5 other developers doing the same thing across the state. I'm bringing them all down." David laughed. "You're 78 years old, and I'm a federal judge who specializes in housing discrimination. These predators have been stealing from elderly people for years because no one fought back. Well, they tried to steal from the wrong old woman." Eleanor looked around her living room, the home Morrison had tried to take, the space filled with memories and family and history. Some battles chose you, and sometimes retirement was just an intermission before the most important fight of all. 3 months after exposing Morrison, Eleanor's living room had transformed into a war room. Case files covered every surface. Her former law clerks volunteered evenings and weekends, and her story had gone viral. "Retired judge destroys developer who tried to steal her home" made national news. The phone calls started immediately. Dozens of elderly homeowners, mostly Black and Latino, reached out with similar stories. Predatory developers, false violations, impossible fines, forced sales. Eleanor documented every case. Patterns emerged. The same tactics, different cities, always targeting the most vulnerable. Elderly widows, people on fixed incomes, communities of color in gentrifying neighborhoods. "Judge, you need to see this." David entered with his laptop. "We traced Morrison's operation back further. He wasn't working alone. There's a network, developers, city inspectors, appraisers, even some local politicians. They've been running this scheme for at least a decade." Eleanor studied the connections David had mapped out. "How much money are we talking about?" "Conservatively, $50 million in stolen equity, maybe more." "And how many families?" "At least 200 that we can prove, probably double that if we dig deeper." Eleanor sat back, thinking. This wasn't just about her house anymore. This was systematic theft, targeting people who couldn't fight back, people who trusted the system to protect them. "We need more than a lawsuit. We need federal intervention." Eleanor picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized 40 years ago. "Time to call in some favors." 2 weeks later, FBI agents raided Morrison's office along with 4 other development companies. The Department of Justice announced a major investigation into coordinated housing fraud. And Eleanor found herself back in a courtroom, not as a judge this time, but as a witness. The federal prosecutor, a woman named Rachel Torres, was nervous. "Judge Reese, you understand you'll be cross-examined. Defense attorneys will try to discredit you. Good luck to them." Eleanor smiled. "I've been cross-examined by better lawyers than Morrison can afford." "I'm not worried." The preliminary hearing was packed. Media, activists, families Morrison had victimized, and Morrison himself, looking diminished without his expensive suit and confident smirk. Eleanor took the stand with the same composure she'd once brought to the bench. She walked the prosecutor through every detail, the false complaints, the inflated fines, the predatory offer. Then Morrison's attorney, Marcus Webb, stood for cross-examination. He was young, aggressive, the kind of lawyer who thought volume mattered more than substance. Ms. Washington." "Judge Reese," Eleanor corrected calmly. "You're retired." "You're no longer a judge." "Technically correct, but I earned the title over 25 years of service. I'd prefer you use it." Webb shifted tactics. "Isn't it true you lived in that house for decades without maintaining it properly?" The violations were legitimate. "Define properly maintained, counselor. My house is 70 years old. It has original hardwood floors, plaster walls, and historic architectural features. Modern code compliance wasn't designed for historic homes, which is why most cities have exceptions. Did your client check if my home qualified for historic protection before filing complaints? Webb consulted his notes. I'm not sure that's relevant. It's extremely relevant. My home is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I have documentation proving that. Your client filed code complaints knowing they were invalid because he was banking on an elderly woman not knowing her rights. Eleanor's voice remained pleasant, but her eyes were steel. Would you like me to walk you through the relevant statute? The prosecutor was trying not to smile. Even the judge looked impressed. Webb pressed on. You accepted my client's offer. You came to closing prepared to sign. I came to closing to document your client's fraud. I've spent 25 years building legal cases. I know how to gather evidence. Eleanor pulled out her own folder. Would you like to see the recording I made of your client explicitly stating his intent to profit from manufactured violations, or the financial analysis showing he knew my property was worth 4 times what he offered? Webb sat down, defeated. The judge called recess. In the hallway, other victims approached Eleanor. Thank you, an elderly black man said, tears in his eyes. They did the same thing to my mother. She lost her house last year. I thought there was nothing we could do. There's always something we can do, Eleanor said. We just need to be willing to fight. The case expanded. Federal investigators discovered Morrison's network had connections in 6 states. The fraud totaled over $100 million. Politicians who'd accepted campaign donations from the developers suddenly found themselves under investigation. Eleanor worked 18-hour days, despite her children begging her to slow down. Mom, you're 78, her daughter Sarah pleaded during a video call. You had a heart scare last year. This stress isn't good for you. This is what keeps me alive, Eleanor replied. These developers thought they could steal from people like me because we're old, because we're black, because we're invisible. I'm showing them we're not. The case went to trial 6 months after Eleanor's testimony. Morrison took a plea deal, 15 years plus full restitution to all victims. 3 other developers went to trial and lost. City inspectors who'd accepted bribes faced charges. Politicians resigned. But the real victory came when Congress passed the Elder Housing Protection Act, legislation directly inspired by Eleanor's case. It created federal oversight of municipal code enforcement, protection for homeowners over 65, and criminal penalties for predatory housing schemes. Eleanor watched the bill signing from her living room, surrounded by the other victims she'd helped. They'd formed a coalition, Elders Against Housing Fraud. Eleanor was the reluctant president. You did this, Judge, David said, raising a glass. You changed the law. We did this. All of us. Eleanor looked around at the faces, black, Latino, Asian, white, all elderly, all survivors. They tried to make us invisible. We made ourselves heard. A year after Morrison's conviction, Eleanor stood in her renovated home. She'd used part of her settlement money to properly restore it. New paint, repaired gutters, updated systems that maintained the historic character. The Rose Garden was immaculate. She was hosting a meeting of the coalition, planning their next steps. Because Morrison's arrest hadn't stopped the problem. New predators emerged. The fight continued. Her doorbell rang. Eleanor opened it to find a young black woman, maybe 30, in a business suit. Judge Reese? I'm Keisha Morris. I'm a housing attorney. I wanted to thank you. My grandmother was one of Morrison's victims. She lost her house 3 years ago. Because of your case, we're getting it back. And I became a lawyer because of you. Eleanor smiled. Come in. We can always use another lawyer. As the meeting started, Eleanor looked around her living room, once threatened, now secure, filled with people continuing the fight. She thought about retirement, about quiet days in the garden, about the peace she'd imagined after leaving the bench. Then she thought about the 200 families who'd gotten their homes back, about the legislation that would protect thousands more, about the young lawyers like Keisha inspired to fight for justice. Retirement could wait. There was too much work to do. And Eleanor Reese, at 78 years old, had never felt more alive. 2 years after the Morrison case, Eleanor Reese's phone rang at 6 a.m. She was already awake. At 79, sleep came in fragments, but early morning calls were rarely good news. Judge Reese? This is Amanda from the coalition. We have a situation. A developer in Baltimore is using Morrison's exact playbook, targeting a 92-year-old woman. Her family just called. Eleanor was already reaching for her notebook. "Tell me everything." Within hours, Eleanor had mobilized her network. Lawyers, investigators, media contacts. The coalition she'd built was now a machine that could deploy across state lines. The Baltimore case was resolved within 2 weeks, the developer backing off once they realized who they were dealing with. Word spread. Predatory developers learned that targeting elderly homeowners came with a risk. You might accidentally target someone connected to Judge Eleanor Reese, and that was a mistake you only made once. But Eleanor knew the real change had to be systemic, not just reactive. She started working with state legislatures, pushing for stronger protections. She testified before Congress again, this time advocating for a national database of housing complaints to identify predatory patterns. Her children worried. Her doctors warned about stress. Eleanor ignored them all. She'd found her purpose again. One afternoon, Eleanor received a visitor she didn't expect. Richard Morrison, released early for cooperation with prosecutors, stood on her porch looking 20 years older than when she'd last seen him. "Judge Reese, I know I'm probably the last person you want to see." Eleanor studied him through the screen door. "What do you want, Mr. Morrison?" "To apologize, properly, not the court-ordered apology, a real one." Morrison's voice was rough. "I spent 18 months in federal prison, lost everything. My wife left, my kids won't speak to me, and I had a lot of time to think about what I did." "You stole people's homes." "I did. I convinced myself it was just business, that if they couldn't afford the fines, they didn't deserve to keep the houses. I was wrong. I know that now." Eleanor opened the door. "Come in." "But if this is some scheme," "It's not. I promise." Morrison followed her to the living room, looking around at the restored Victorian features. "You did beautiful work on the house. With the settlement money from suing you." "Yes." They sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Morrison spoke. "I've been attending the coalition meetings. In the back. I didn't think you'd want to know I was there, but I wanted to understand, to see the people I hurt." "Why?" "Because my parole officer said I needed to make amends. But also because, in prison, I met men who'd been where I put people, who'd lost everything because someone decided they didn't matter, and I realized I'd become exactly what I hated about my own father." Eleanor waited. "My dad lost our family home to a predatory lender when I was 12. Bank took everything. We lived in a shelter for 6 months. I swore I'd never be powerless like that again, so I became the predator instead." Morrison looked at his hands. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I want to help, if you'll let me." Eleanor considered this. She'd seen plenty of convicts claim redemption. Most were lying. But Morrison's body language, his willingness to sit in a room full of his victims, that suggested something genuine. "What kind of help?" "I know how developers think, how they find targets, how they exploit loopholes. I could help you identify schemes before they destroy families. Teach your coalition what to look for. You want me to work with the man who tried to steal my house. I want to undo some of the damage I caused. It won't make up for what I did, but it's something." Eleanor thought about her years on the bench, about justice versus vengeance, about whether people could truly change. Then she thought about the families still at risk, the predators still operating. "You'll work under David's supervision. You'll get no payment, and the moment you do anything questionable, you're out. Understood?" Morrison nodded, something like hope crossing his face. "Understood." Morrison proved valuable. He identified 3 major fraud schemes in the first month alone. His insider knowledge helped the coalition prevent dozens of families from losing their homes. He testified at city council meetings, explaining developer tactics with the blunt honesty of someone with nothing left to lose. It was strange watching the man who'd targeted her become an advocate. But Eleanor had learned that redemption was complicated. It didn't erase the harm, but it could maybe balance the scales slightly. 6 months into Morrison's work with the coalition, they uncovered their biggest case yet. A nationwide scheme involving a major bank, systematically targeting elderly minority homeowners through reverse mortgage fraud, Hundreds of families across 20 states. This is bigger than anything Morrison did, David said, reviewing the evidence. This is institutional. We need more than local lawyers. We need a federal task force. Eleanor made calls. Within a week, the FBI was involved. Within a month, the bank was under investigation. The case would take years to resolve, but Eleanor had time and patience and a network of people who refused to let the vulnerable be victimized. On her 80th birthday, Eleanor's children threw her a party. Her living room was packed, family, coalition members, lawyers, former victims, now advocates. Even Morrison, who hung back awkwardly until Eleanor's grandson dragged him into conversation. "Mom, when are you going to retire?" Sarah asked. "Actually retire?" "When the work is done." "The work is never done." "Exactly." Eleanor smiled. "Your father and I bought this house in 1980, raised you kids here, built a life here. When Morrison tried to take it, he wasn't just stealing property, he was stealing history, family, belonging." She looked around at the people filling her home. "I got my house back. Now I'm making sure everyone else can keep theirs." David approached with champagne. "Judge, I have news. The bank case, they're offering a $500 million settlement, full restitution to all victims plus reforms. Did we get the policy changes?" "Every one. New oversight, mandatory disclosures, criminal penalties for fraud." Eleanor raised her glass. "Then we won." As the party continued, Morrison approached hesitantly. "Judge Reese, I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance. I know I don't deserve it. You don't. But my grandmother always said people deserve second chances, not because they've earned them, but because mercy is stronger than judgment." Eleanor paused. "Don't waste it." "I won't. I promise." Eleanor Reese died peacefully at 85, in the home she'd fought to keep. She'd spent her final years expanding the coalition to all 50 states, training the next generation of housing advocates, and testifying before Congress 3 more times. Her obituary called her a champion of housing justice, but the people she'd helped knew her simply as Judge Reese, the woman who refused to be a victim, who turned an attempted theft into a movement, who proved that age and retirement were no match for righteous anger and legal expertise. Her house was donated to the coalition, converted into a training center and resource hub. A plaque outside reads, "Eleanor Reese House," a reminder that home is worth fighting for. And in living rooms across America, elderly homeowners facing suspicious fines and predatory offers remember her story. They call the coalition. They fight back. They refuse to be invisible. Because Judge Eleanor Reese taught them that sometimes the people you think are powerless are exactly the ones who'll bring you down. And sometimes retirement is just the intermission before your most important work begins. If this story inspired you, remember that housing predators target the vulnerable, elderly people, people of color, anyone they think won't fight back. But everyone deserves to keep their home. Everyone deserves dignity. And no one is too old, too tired, or too powerless to demand justice. Judge Reese was 78 when she started her second career as a housing advocate. She proved that your most important work might come when everyone expects you to fade away. Don't let them steal your home. Don't let them steal your voice. And remember, judges never really retire. They just choose which battles to fight next.